The winter air in Cascade Falls, Montana, bit with a kind of cold that felt personal, sharp, and unforgiving. It was the first week of December, and the small mountain town wore its Christmas decorations like armor against the approaching darkness of the season. Storefronts glowed with warm lights, garlands hung from lampposts, and the scent of pine and cinnamon drifted from the local bakery. But for some, the festive cheer was a cruel reminder of how far they had fallen. Sarah Mitchell sat on a worn wool blanket in the recessed doorway of a long-closed hardware store, her back against the cold brick, her arms wrapped around the only family she had left.
If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today.
Ranger, a scruffy mixed-breed dog with intelligent brown eyes and a coat that had once been golden but was now matted and dull, pressed his warm body against her side. His breath formed small clouds in the frigid air, and his tail gave a weak thump when she ran her fingers through his fur. She was 32 years old, but the streets had aged her. Her face, once open and bright, was now gaunt and weathered. Her dark hair, pulled back in a tangled ponytail, showed streaks of premature gray. She wore layers of thrift store clothes, a faded army jacket over 2 sweaters, jeans with holes at the knees, and boots held together with duct tape. On the blanket beside her sat a small cardboard sign written in neat, careful letters. Homeless vet. Hungry. Anything helps. God bless. Sarah had served 6 years in the Army as a combat medic, 2 tours in Afghanistan. She had saved lives under fire, had earned commendations for valor, and had come home with invisible wounds that no metal could heal. PTSD, chronic pain from an IED blast, and a VA system so overwhelmed it had failed her at every turn. She had lost her apartment, then her car, then everything but Ranger, the dog she had adopted from a shelter 3 years ago when she still had hope. Ranger had become her lifeline, her alarm system, her therapist, and her reason to keep going when the darkness whispered that it would be easier to just stop. Across the street, Marcus Caldwell emerged from the town's most expensive restaurant, the Summit House, adjusting the collar of his $5,000 cashmere coat. He was in his late 42s, tall and immaculately groomed, with silver-streaked hair, styled with precision, and a face that radiated the kind of confidence that only extreme wealth could buy. He was a real estate mogul, a man whose empire stretched across 3 states, built on luxury developments and high-end resort properties. He had come to Cascade Falls to finalize the purchase of the last piece of land he needed for his newest project, the Cascade Crown, a billion-dollar luxury ski resort that would transform the sleepy town into a playground for the ultra-wealthy. He didn't care that it would price out the locals, that it would destroy the character of the place. Progress, he called it, evolution. Behind him trailed his assistant, Jeremy, a nervous young man in his 22s who carried Marcus's briefcase and spent most of his time apologizing for his boss's behavior. And beside Jeremy walked Marcus's newest acquisition, a purebred Belgian Malinois named Titan, a $15,000 show dog that Marcus had purchased not out of love for animals, but because owning such a dog was a status symbol. Titan was beautiful, sleek, and powerful, but he was also anxious, overtrained by handlers who cared more about obedience than bonding. The dog pulled at his expensive leather leash, sniffing the air, his instincts telling him something was wrong with the way his new owner treated him. Marcus walked with the arrogant stride of a man who believed the world existed to serve him. His eyes swept over the town with barely concealed disdain. "Quaint," he muttered to Jeremy. "That's the polite word for poor, isn't it?" As they crossed the street toward the parking garage where Marcus's Range Rover waited, his gaze fell on Sarah and Ranger in the doorway. His lip curled in disgust. "Look at that," he said loudly, stopping in front of her. "The town's decorating for Christmas with human garbage." Sarah kept her eyes down, a survival instinct honed by months on the street. She had learned not to engage, not to look people like him in the eye. It only made things worse. But Ranger, ever protective, sensed the threat in Marcus's tone. He lifted his head, a low warning growl rumbling in his chest. Marcus noticed the dog, and something cruel sparked in his eyes. He saw not a loyal animal, but an opportunity to demonstrate his dominance, to remind the world that people like Sarah were beneath him. "Your mutt is aggressive," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "That's a public safety hazard. He's not aggressive," Sarah said quietly, her voice hoarse from disuse and cold. "He's just protecting me. Please, just leave us alone." Marcus took a step closer, deliberately invading her space. He looked down at her with the kind of disdain he usually reserved for bad investments. "You want to be left alone? Then get off the street. Get a job. Stop being a burden on society." "I'm a veteran," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I served my country." Marcus laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Served your country? And look where it got you. Sitting in a doorway, begging. What a waste." The cruelty in his words cut deeper than the cold ever could. Sarah felt tears sting her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had cried enough. Ranger, however, had heard enough. He barked once, a sharp, protective sound, and tried to place himself between Sarah and the threat. That was all the excuse Marcus needed. "Shut that thing up," he snarled. And before Jeremy or anyone could react, Marcus drew back his $2,000 Italian leather shoe and kicked. The blow caught Ranger in the ribs, a vicious, deliberate strike. The dog yelped, a sound of pain and betrayal, and stumbled sideways. He scrambled back to Sarah, whimpering, pressing against her as she wrapped her arms around him, her body shaking with rage and helplessness. "You bastard," she choked out, her voice breaking. "He didn't do anything to you." Marcus just shrugged, adjusting his coat as if he'd done nothing more than swat a fly. "Should have kept your mutt under control." He turned to walk away, a satisfied smirk on his face. He didn't see the man who had been standing in the shadow of the building 20 feet away, watching the entire scene unfold. But Sarah did. Through her tears, she saw him emerge from the darkness, and for a moment, she thought she was hallucinating. The figure was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in dark jeans, a heavy winter jacket, and a black beanie. His face was shadowed, but there was something about the way he moved, the controlled, predatory grace, that made her breath catch. And beside him, on a simple tactical leash, walked a German shepherd that looked like it had been carved from granite and shadow. The dog was massive, easily 90 pounds, with alert ears and eyes that glowed with an intelligence that was almost human. This was no pet. This was a weapon, disciplined and deadly. The man's voice, when he spoke, was low and calm, but it carried across the cold street like a blade. "You need to apologize." Marcus stopped. He turned slowly, his expression one of annoyed disbelief, and found himself facing a man whose presence radiated a kind of danger he had never encountered in boardrooms or country clubs. "Excuse me?" Marcus said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Who the hell are you?" The man took 3 steps forward, closing the distance with an economy of movement that was both casual and terrifying. His face came into the light, and Sarah gasped. She knew that face. She knew those eyes, the same piercing blue as her own. "Jake?" she whispered, her voice so quiet only Ranger heard her. Jake Mitchell was 35 years old, a Navy SEAL with 12 years of service, a man who had operated in the darkest corners of the world. He had been on a rare 30-day leave, hiking alone in the mountains of Montana, seeking the kind of silence that only wilderness could provide. He had planned to visit his sister, Sarah, whom he hadn't seen in 2 years due to his deployments. He had arrived in Cascade Falls just hours ago, asking around for her last known address, only to be told by a kind woman at a church that Sarah was on the streets. The news had hit him like a physical blow, a failure he could never forgive himself for. He had been hunting monsters overseas while his sister had fallen through the cracks at home. He had been searching for her when he saw the scene outside the restaurant. And now, standing in front of the man who had just assaulted his sister and her dog, Jake Mitchell was no longer on leave. He was operational. His K-9 partner, Axe, a German shepherd trained in tactical assault and protection, sat at his side, perfectly still. His dark eyes locked on Marcus Caldwell with the unblinking focus of a predator sizing up prey.
If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this.
"I'm the person telling you to apologize," Jake said, his voice still quiet, to her, and to her dog. Marcus looked Jake up and down, taking in the worn jeans, the simple jacket, and saw not a threat, but another nobody. He laughed, a sound of genuine amusement. "You think I'm going to apologize to that homeless junkie? You're as crazy as she is. Now get out of my way before I call the police." Jake didn't move. His expression didn't change. But something shifted in the air, a drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the Montana winter. "Call them," Jake said. "I'll wait." Jeremy, Marcus's assistant, felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He had seen enough action movies to recognize what was happening. This wasn't a confrontation. This was a predator giving prey one last chance to run. "Mr. Caldwell," Jeremy said, his voice high and nervous. "Maybe we should just go." I'm sure Marcus cut him off with a sharp gesture. He turned, his attention back to Jake, his ego too inflated to recognize the danger. "You know what? I'm tired of people like you," Marcus snarled, "thinking you can intimidate me. Do you have any idea who I am? I own half this state. I could buy and sell you 1,000 times over." Jake's expression remained utterly calm. "I don't care." And then, as if to punctuate his point, Marcus made the worst decision of his life. He reached out and shoved Jake's shoulder, a contemptuous push meant to assert dominance. It was like pushing a mountain. Jake didn't budge, didn't even sway. But Axe did react. The German shepherd surged to his feet, a deep, guttural snarl erupting from his chest that sounded like it came from the depths of hell. He didn't lunge, didn't attack. He simply positioned himself directly in front of Jake, his entire body coiled like a spring, his message unmistakable. "Touch him again, and you will not walk away." Marcus stumbled back, his face going pale. For the first time in unpop decades, he felt genuine fear. That's when Jake spoke again, his voice dropping even lower, each word measured and cold. "You put your hands on me. That's assault. You kicked a defenseless animal. That's animal cruelty. You verbally abused a homeless veteran. That's harassment. I could have my partner here put you on the ground in 3 seconds, and it would be completely justified." He took 1 step forward. Marcus took 2 steps back. "But I'm going to give you a chance," Jake continued. "A chance you didn't give my sister. You're going to apologize to her. You're going to give her enough money to cover a month in a motel and food for her and her dog, and then you're going to walk away and pray I never see you again." Marcus's mouth opened and closed. His brain, so accustomed to being in control, couldn't process what was happening. This wasn't how the world worked. He was Marcus Caldwell. He didn't apologize to anyone. "Your sister?" he finally stammered, his gaze darting to Sarah, who was now standing, her hand on Ranger, her eyes wide with shock and hope. "She served her country," Jake said, his voice like gravel. "She saved lives. She came home broken, and the system failed her. And you, a man who's never sacrificed a damn thing in his life, just kicked her dog for sport." Jake's hand moved to his pocket, and in one smooth motion, he pulled out a simple leather wallet. He flipped it open, revealing not a driver's license, but a military ID card. Petty Officer First Class Jake Mitchell, Naval Special Warfare Development Group. That's SEAL Team 6 for people like you who don't know. The color drained entirely from Marcus's face. Jeremy actually took a step back, his eyes wide. Even Titan, Marcus's expensive show dog, seemed to cower, sensing the shift in power. Marcus Caldwell had spent his entire life believing that money was the ultimate power. But standing in that cold Montana street, facing a man whose power came from discipline, training, and an unshakable moral code, he realized how utterly wrong he had been. His hands were shaking as he reached into his coat and pulled out his wallet. He fumbled with it, his fingers clumsy, and pulled out a wad of $100 bills. He didn't count them. He just held them out towards Sarah, his arm trembling. I'm sorry," he said, his voice cracking. "I was out of line. Please, take this." Sarah looked at the money, then at her brother, then back at Marcus. She walked forward slowly, Ranger limping slightly at her side. She took the money, her hand steady despite everything, and looked Marcus Caldwell directly in the eye for the first time. "I don't want your money because you're scared," she said quietly. "I want it because you finally see me as a human being." She turned away from him, walked past Jake, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to cry. Jake watched his sister walk away, then turned his cold gaze back to Marcus. "If I ever hear your name associated with cruelty, greed, or harm to anyone in this town, I will find you," Jake said. "And next time, I won't be this polite. Understood?" Marcus nodded frantically. He grabbed Jeremy's arm and stumbled toward the parking garage, practically running, his expensive coat flapping behind him like the wings of a fleeing bird. Jake watched him go, then knelt down beside Axe. "Good boy," he murmured, scratching the dog behind the ears. "Stand down." Axe relaxed immediately, his tail giving a single, satisfied wag. Jake stood and walked over to where Sarah had collapsed onto her blanket, her body shaking with sobs. He knelt beside her and, without a word, pulled her into his arms. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have been here. I should have found you sooner." She clung to him, her fingers gripping his jacket like he might disappear. "You're here now," she choked out. "That's all that matters." Ranger, still tender from the kick, but sensing the safety of the moment, limped over and pushed his head under Jake's free hand. Jake smiled and scratched the dog's ears. "Let's get you both somewhere warm," Jake said, helping Sarah to her feet. He gathered her blanket and her few belongings, shouldering the small backpack that contained everything she owned. As they walked down the street, Axe on one side and Ranger on the other, Sarah looked up at her brother. "How did you find me?" "I didn't," Jake admitted. "I was looking for you. Planned to search all night if I had to. I just happened to see that bastard kick your dog." Sarah managed a weak smile. Divine intervention? Jake looked down at her, his expression softening. "Maybe. Or maybe the universe knew I needed a reason to remind myself why I do what I do. To protect people who can't protect themselves. People like you." They walked in silence for a few moments, the snow beginning to fall in soft, gentle flakes. "I'm not leaving you again, Sarah," Jake said. "Not until you're back on your feet. And then, only if you tell me to go." She squeezed his arm. "I don't think I'll ever tell you to go." And for the first time in a very long time, Sarah Mitchell felt something she thought she'd lost forever. Hope. The small motel room was nothing special. 2 double beds with faded floral quilts, a TV that probably still had a VCR hookup, and a bathroom with flickering fluorescent lights. But to Sarah Mitchell, it might as well have been a 5-star resort. Jake had checked them in using his own credit card, paying for 2 weeks up front without hesitation. He had then walked 3 blocks to the local grocery store and returned with bags full of food. Sandwich meat, bread, fruit, dog food, treats for both Ranger and Axe, and a first aid kit. Now, as the evening settled over Cascade Falls and the snow continued to fall outside the window, Sarah sat on one of the beds, showered, and wearing clean clothes Jake had bought at a nearby thrift store. Her hair was still damp, pulled back in a simple braid, and for the first time in months, her face looked younger, softer, the hard edge of survival temporarily eased. Ranger lay beside her, his ribs bandaged where Jake had gently examined him and determined nothing was broken, just deep bruising. The dog's tail thumped weakly against the comforter, his eyes half closed in contentment. On the other bed, Axe lay in a perfect down position, his head on his paws, his dark eyes watching everything with calm vigilance. Even at rest, he radiated a professional awareness that marked him as something far beyond a pet. Jake sat at the small table by the window, a laptop open in front of him. He had been on the phone for the past hour, first with his commanding officer, then with a contact at the VA, and finally with a local veterans advocacy group. His voice had been clipped and professional, but Sarah could hear the barely contained fury underneath. He ended the last call and closed the laptop, running a hand over his face. Sarah watched him, guilt gnawing at her. "I'm sorry you had to see me like this, Jake. I tried to. I didn't want you to know." Jake turned to face her, his expression softening. "Sarah, you have nothing to apologize for. I'm the one who should be sorry. I knew you were struggling after you got out, but I was deployed, and then I was training, and He shook his head. I should have made you a priority. You were saving lives, Sarah said. You were doing important work. And you weren't? Jake countered. You were a combat medic. You saved more lives than I ever have. The difference is, the system failed you when you came home, and I let it. Sarah looked down at her hands, calloused and scarred from months of life on the street. How did it get this bad? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. I used to be someone, Jake. I had an apartment, I had a car, I had plans, and then it all just fell apart. Jake pulled his chair over and sat across from her, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees. Tell me. All of it. She took a deep breath, and the story spilled out. The nightmares that started 6 months after she returned from Afghanistan, the chronic pain from the IED blast that had thrown her against a Humvee, fracturing 3 vertebrae, the VA appointments that were scheduled 6 months out, the pain medication that helped at first, but then became another problem, the job she lost because she couldn't stand for 8-hour shifts, the apartment she couldn't afford, the car that was repossessed, the shelters that were full or unsafe, the slow, humiliating descent into homelessness. And through it all, Ranger, she said, her voice breaking as she reached over to stroke the dog's head. He was the only reason I didn't give up. When the nightmares were bad, he'd wake me. When I thought about ending it, he'd lick my face and remind me I wasn't alone. Jake's jaw tightened. He had seen the aftermath of failed systems in war zones, but seeing it happen to his own sister in his own country ignited a cold fury that was far more dangerous than rage. That ends now, he said, his voice firm. Tomorrow, we're going to the VA office. I have contacts there now, people who owe me favors. You're getting an emergency psychiatric evaluation, a full medical workup, and we're expediting your disability claim. You're also getting into a transitional housing program I found. It's veteran-specific, and they have space. Jake, I can't ask you to. You're not asking, Jake interrupted. I'm telling you. You're my sister. You served your country. You deserve better than what you got, and I'm going to make damn sure you get it. Sarah felt fresh tears sting her eyes, but these were different. These were tears of relief, of gratitude, of feeling seen and valued for the first time in so long. What about you? She asked. Don't you have to get back to your team? I'm on leave for 3 more weeks, Jake said. And even if I wasn't, I'd extend it. You're the mission now, Sarah, and I don't leave a mission unfinished. From his spot on the other bed, Axe lifted his head and gave a soft, approving woof. See? Jake said with a small smile. Even Axe agrees. For the first time in what felt like years, Sarah laughed. It was a small, fragile sound, but it was real. They spent the rest of the evening in comfortable silence. Jake ordered pizza, and they ate together, sharing bites with the dogs. Sarah told stories about her time in Afghanistan, the good moments, the time she felt like she was making a difference. Jake shared his own stories, carefully edited to remove the classified details, but enough to let her see that he understood the weight of service. As midnight approached and Sarah drifted off to sleep, Ranger curled up beside her. Jake moved to the window. He looked out at the quiet street, the Christmas lights twinkling in the snow, and pulled out his encrypted phone. He typed a message to his team commander. Situation resolved. For now, family. Emergency stable. Will update in 72 hours. The response was immediate. Understood. Take the time you need. Your sister is a priority. Semper Fi. Jake smiled. His team understood. His team always understood. But as he looked out into the night, his thoughts drifted to Marcus Caldwell. Men like that didn't change easily. They didn't suddenly become compassionate because of one confrontation. Jake had seen it too many times, bullies who retreated when faced with superior force only to find new, more subtle ways to assert their power. Marcus Caldwell was a problem, and problems, Jake knew, had a way of escalating. He glanced back at his sleeping sister, at the fragile peace she had finally found. If Caldwell came back, if he threatened her or anyone like her again, Jake would be ready. And next time, he wouldn't stop at words. The next morning arrived with the brittle clarity of a Montana winter. The snow had stopped, leaving the town blanketed in pristine white, the kind of postcard-perfect scene that hid the ugliness lurking beneath. Jake was up before dawn, a habit ingrained by years of military discipline. He took Axe for a run through the quiet streets, the German shepherd moving with powerful, ground-eating strides beside him. The cold air burned his lungs in a way that felt cleansing, centering. When he returned to the motel, Sarah was awake, sitting on the edge of her bed with Ranger's head in her lap. She looked rested, but there was a nervous energy about her, the anticipation of facing bureaucracies that had failed her before. "Ready?" Jake asked gently. "As I'll ever be." They drove to the VA clinic in Jake's rented truck, Axe sitting calmly in the back seat. The clinic was a low, utilitarian building on the edge of town, its parking lot already half full despite the early hour. Inside, the waiting room was a depressing tableau of faded chairs, outdated magazines, and veterans in various states of physical and emotional distress. The woman behind the reception desk looked up with the exhausted expression of someone who had heard every hard luck story 1,000 times. Jake approached with Sarah at his side, his posture straight, his military ID already in hand. "Good morning," he said, his voice polite but carrying an unmistakable authority. "I'm Petty Officer Jake Mitchell. This is my sister, Sarah Mitchell, a combat veteran. She needs an emergency intake appointment." The receptionist barely glanced at the ID. "Sir, our next available intake appointment is in April. If you'd like to schedule," Jake leaned forward, placing both hands on the counter, his voice dropping to a low, intense register. "My sister is a Purple Heart recipient who served 2 combat tours as a medic. She's been homeless for 4 months due to untreated PTSD and chronic pain. I'm requesting an emergency evaluation under the Veterans Crisis Line protocol. If you tell me she has to wait until April, I'm going to make a phone call to Senator Patricia Hammond's office. She's on the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, and she's a personal friend. Would you like me to make that call?" The receptionist's eyes widened. She glanced at her computer screen, her fingers suddenly moving with purpose. Let me check with the clinic supervisor." She disappeared through a door. 5 minutes later, a man in his 50s with gray hair and kind eyes emerged. He wore a name tag that read, "Dr. Robert Chen, Clinical Director. Petty Officer Mitchell, I'm Dr. Chen. Please come with me." Within an hour, Sarah was in an examination room being evaluated by Dr. Chen and a psychiatric nurse. Jake sat in the waiting room, Axe at his feet, making a series of phone calls. He spoke with a Veterans Housing Coordinator, a representative from Disabled American Veterans, and finally, his own SEAL Team's Advocate Liaison. Every call ended the same way. "Understood. We'll expedite this." When Sarah emerged 3 hours later, she looked exhausted but lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. Dr. Chen shook Jake's hand. "Your sister is going to be okay, but it's going to take time. We've started her on a treatment plan for PTSD and chronic pain management. I've also expedited her disability claim. She should have an answer within 30 days instead of the usual 18 months. And I've secured her a spot in our transitional housing program starting next week." Jake felt a surge of relief. "Thank you, Doctor." "Don't thank me," Dr. Chen said. "Thank the system that should have caught her before she fell through the cracks." He looked at Sarah. "You did good work over there, soldier. We're going to make sure you get the support you deserve." As they walked out into the cold afternoon, Sarah stopped and turned to her brother. "How did you do that?" she asked. "I've been trying to get help for months. You walked in and made it happen in 3 hours." Jake looked at her, his expression serious. "Because I know how to navigate the system, and I'm not afraid to make noise. Most veterans don't know who to call or how to push back when they're told no. You're not alone anymore, Sarah. You have me, and I know how to fight these battles." They drove back toward the motel, but Jake made a detour. He pulled up in front of a small law office on Main Street. "One more stop," he said. Inside, they met with a lawyer named Caroline Reese, a woman in her 42s who specialized in veterans advocacy and civil rights. Jake had found her through an online search and had called ahead. Miss. Reese listened intently as Jake and Sarah described the assault by Marcus Caldwell. She took notes, her expression growing darker. "What you're describing is assault and animal cruelty, both criminal offenses," she said. "But more importantly, Mr. Caldwell is a public figure with a pattern of behavior. I've been tracking him for months. He's currently trying to push through a development project that would displace dozens of low-income families. Your story, Sarah, could be the catalyst for a much larger investigation." "I don't want to be famous," Sarah said quickly. "I just want to be left alone." Caroline nodded. "I understand. But sometimes the best way to protect yourself is to expose the person who hurt you. I'm willing to take this case pro bono. We'll file a police report, pursue criminal charges, and if necessary, a civil suit for damages. And we'll make sure the media knows exactly who Marcus Caldwell really is." Jake looked at his sister. "It's your call, Sarah." Sarah thought about the moment Marcus had kicked Ranger, the casual cruelty, the utter lack of remorse. She thought about all the others he had probably hurt, all the people he had trampled on his way to building his empire. "Okay," she said quietly. "Let's do it." Caroline smiled. "Good. I'll get started immediately." As they left the office, Jake's phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "You made a mistake threatening me. Mitchell, I will bury you and your sister." Jake stared at the message, his expression hardening. He showed it to Sarah. "That's from him, isn't it?" she asked, her voice tight. "Yes. What do we do?" Jake forwarded the message to Caroline Reese and to the local police. Then he looked at his sister. "We let him try," he said. "And when he does, we finish this." Across town, in the penthouse suite of Cascade Falls' only luxury hotel, Marcus Caldwell was unraveling. He had spent the night drinking expensive scotch and pacing his suite, replaying the humiliation of the confrontation over and over in his mind. He was Marcus Caldwell. He was a billionaire. He was untouchable. And yet, some military nobody had made him grovel in the street. It was intolerable. He grabbed his phone and called the one person he knew could fix this, Victor Hale. Victor Hale was a fixer, a man who operated in the shadows of the wealthy and powerful. He specialized in making problems disappear through legal intimidation, blackmail, or when necessary, more direct methods. He was expensive, discreet, and utterly ruthless. The phone rang twice before a smooth, cultured voice answered. "Mr. Caldwell, what can I do for you?" "I have a problem," Marcus said. "A Navy SEAL and his homeless sister. They're threatening to destroy my reputation." There was a pause. Victor Hale was processing, calculating. "Details," he said. Marcus described the encounter, leaving out his own actions, framing it as unprovoked aggression. He described Jake and Sarah, giving what physical details he could remember. "This SEAL," Victor said. "Did he threaten you directly?" "Yes," he said. "If I didn't apologize and pay, he'd ruin me." It was a lie, but Marcus had spent his life twisting truth to suit his needs. "Understood," Victor said. "I'll handle it. Give me 48 hours. What are you going to do?" Victor's laugh was cold. "You hired me to make problems disappear, Mr. Caldwell. I don't explain my methods. You just wake up one morning and your problem is gone." The call ended. Marcus sat back in his chair, a satisfied smile spreading across his face. Jake Mitchell had no idea who he was dealing with, but he was about to find out. The attack came that night, swift and brutal. Sarah and Jake had returned to the motel after dinner, exhausted but hopeful. Jake had left Axe outside, doing a perimeter sweep of the property, a nightly routine that kept the dog sharp. He was in the bathroom when he heard it, a sharp yelp of pain from outside, followed by the sound of screeching tires. Jake exploded out of the bathroom, his instincts screaming danger. He burst through the motel room door to find Axe lying on the pavement, his body still, blood pooling beneath him. No. Jake dropped to his knees beside his partner, his hands moving with the practiced efficiency of a combat medic. Axe had been hit by a vehicle, a deliberate hit and run. His rear leg was shattered, and there was a deep gash along his side. But the dog was alive, his eyes opened, looking up at Jake with trust and pain. "Stay with me, buddy," Jake whispered, his voice cracking. "Stay with me." Sarah was there a moment later, her own trauma momentarily forgotten as she dropped down beside them. She assessed the injuries with the clinical eye of a combat medic. "We need to stop the bleeding and get him to a vet. Now." Jake scooped Axe into his arms, cradling the 90-pound dog like he weighed nothing. They loaded him into the truck, Sarah applying pressure to the wound with towels from the motel room. Jake drove with controlled fury, his jaw clenched, his mind already running through scenarios. This wasn't an accident. This was a message. The emergency veterinary clinic was 10 miles outside of town. By the time they arrived, Axe's breathing was shallow, his eyes glazed with pain and shock. The vet, a woman named Dr. Patel, took one look and immediately called for her surgical team. "He's going into emergency surgery. You did good work stabilizing him. Now, I need you to wait." Jake and Sarah sat in the sterile waiting room, covered in blood, numb with shock and rage. "This was Caldwell," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "He did this to hurt you, to hurt us." Jake didn't respond. He was staring at the wall, his mind in a dark, dangerous place. After 3 hours, Dr. Patel emerged, exhausted but cautiously optimistic. "He's alive. The surgery went well. His leg is pinned and stabilized, and we've repaired the internal damage. He's going to need weeks of recovery, but he'll make it. He's a fighter." Jake closed his eyes, relief crashing over him like a wave. "Thank you." Dr. Patel placed a hand on his shoulder. "Someone did this deliberately. The injuries are consistent with a vehicle ramming him at low speed. That's not an accident. That's attempted murder of a service animal, which is a federal crime." Jake looked up at her. "I know who did it." "Then make sure he pays," Dr. Patel said quietly. The next morning, Jake made a call to his own ranch. "Commanding officer." He explained the situation, his voice cold and controlled. "Permission to extend leave and handle this situation, sir. It's personal now." "Permission granted," the commander said. "But Mitchell, keep it legal. I don't want to have to bail you out of a federal prison." "Understood, sir." But Jake had no intention of staying entirely within the lines. Victor Hale had made a critical mistake. He had hurt Jake's partner. And Jake Mitchell never left a man or a dog behind. The war had just begun. The counteroffensive began with information warfare, and Jake Mitchell was very, very good at it. He spent the next 2 days conducting what the military called a pattern of life analysis on Marcus Caldwell. He hacked into nothing that would be illegal, but he didn't need to. Marcus Caldwell was a public figure with a massive digital footprint, and he was arrogant enough to believe that his wealth made him invincible. Jake compiled everything: business records, legal disputes, social media posts, news articles, and public records of property acquisitions. He built a comprehensive dossier that painted a picture of a man whose empire was built on exploitation, intimidation, and barely legal maneuvering. But the key was Victor Hale. Through a contact in Naval Criminal Investigative Service, Jake learned that Victor Hale was currently under federal investigation for racketeering and conspiracy. He was a high-value target, but the feds didn't have enough evidence to move on him yet. Jake could give them that evidence. He reached out to Caroline Reese, the attorney, and handed her the dossier, along with a recorded copy of the threatening text message Marcus had sent. He also provided her with security footage from the motel parking lot footage that clearly showed a black Range Rover, registered to Marcus Caldwell, speeding through the lot at the exact time Axe was hit. Caroline's eyes widened as she reviewed the evidence. "This is enough to file criminal charges," she said. "Assault, animal cruelty, intimidation of a witness, and now attempted destruction of federal property. That dog is a military asset. This is a federal case." "File it," Jake said. "All of it. Today." She did. By noon, the Cascade Falls Police Department had issued a warrant for Marcus Caldwell's arrest. By 2 p.m., federal agents from the FBI's Helena field office had arrived to take over the investigation, citing the involvement of a military working dog and potential interstate criminal activity. By 4 p.m., Marcus Caldwell was in custody. He was arrested at his hotel, escorted out in handcuffs, in front of a crowd of shocked onlookers and several local news crews who had been tipped off anonymously, of course, about the developing story. His face, red with rage and humiliation, was plastered across every local and regional news outlet by evening. Billionaire developer arrested in assault on homeless veteran and military dog, the story went viral within hours. Jake watched the news coverage from Axe's recovery kennel at the vet clinic. The German Shepherd was awake, groggy from pain medication, but his tail gave a weak thump when Jake scratched behind his ears. "We got him, boy," Jake murmured. "He's not going to hurt anyone else." Sarah stood in the doorway, watching her brother with a mixture of awe and gratitude. "You did this," she said softly. "We did this," Jake corrected. "You were brave enough to stand up. I just made sure the right people listened. But it wasn't over yet." 2 days later, while Marcus Caldwell sat in a federal holding cell awaiting his arraignment, another name surfaced in the investigation: Victor Hale. Federal agents, following the trail Jake had helped lay out, had connected Hale to Marcus and to the hit and run. Security footage from a nearby business showed Hale driving the Range Rover he had been behind the wheel, not Marcus, but Marcus had given the order. Conspiracy to commit assault on a federal asset. Hale was arrested at a private airfield, attempting to flee the country. With both men in custody, the full scope of their operation began to unravel. Caroline Reese, working with federal prosecutors, uncovered a pattern of harassment, intimidation, and violence, targeting low-income families, veterans, and anyone who stood in the way of Caldwell's developments. There were at least 15 other victims, people too scared or too broken to come forward. Until now. Emboldened by Sarah's courage and Jake's protection, they began to speak out. The media firestorm intensified. National news outlets picked up the story. Veterans advocacy groups rallied. Social media exploded with hashtags like #JusticeForSarah and #ProtectOurVets. Marcus Caldwell's business empire began to crumble. Investors pulled out, partners distanced themselves. His luxury development stalled as local governments reopened reviews of permits and zoning changes that had been suspiciously fast-tracked. Within 2 weeks, Marcus Caldwell went from a billionaire developer to a defendant facing decades in federal prison. And through it all, Jake Mitchell remained in the shadows, a ghost who had walked into a small town, protected his sister, and brought down an empire. 3 weeks later, Sarah Mitchell stood outside a small, modest apartment building on the outskirts of Cascade Falls. It was nothing fancy, a 2-bedroom unit in a veteran-subsidized housing complex, but it was hers, clean, safe, and warm. Jake helped her carry in the few belongings she had accumulated: new clothes, kitchenware, and a large dog bed for Ranger, who trotted happily through the rooms, tail wagging, marking his new territory. "This is really mine?" Sarah asked, her voice thick with emotion. "It's really yours," Jake confirmed. "Fully funded through your VA disability. You've got counseling lined up, a part-time job at the VA clinic starting next month, and this place for as long as you need." Sarah turned to her brother, tears streaming down her face, and hugged him tightly. "I don't know how to thank you." Jake held her, his own eyes stinging. "You don't have to thank me. You're my sister. This is what family does." From the doorway, there was a soft woof. Axe stood there, his rear leg in a brace, but his eyes bright and alert. He had been released from the vet clinic that morning, cleared for light duty and recovery at home. Jake knelt down, and the German Shepherd limped over, pressing his head against Jake's chest. "Good boy," Jake whispered. "We did it, buddy. Mission accomplished." That evening, as the sun set over the Montana mountains, Jake, Sarah, Axe, and Ranger sat on the small patio of the apartment, sharing a simple meal. For the first time in years, Sarah felt whole, and Jake, for the first time in months, felt at peace. He had left the battlefield to find his sister broken and alone. He was leaving her whole, safe, and with a future. That was worth more than any medal. The trial of Marcus Caldwell and Victor Hale became one of the most publicized federal cases of the year. Marcus, facing overwhelming evidence, took a plea deal to avoid a life sentence. He was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison and ordered to pay $20 million in restitution to his victims, including Sarah Mitchell. Victor Hale, refusing to cooperate, went to trial and was convicted on multiple counts of racketeering, conspiracy, and assault. He received 25 years. The Cascade Crown Development Project was permanently canceled. The land was purchased by a conservation trust and turned into a public park and veterans retreat center, named in honor of Sarah Mitchell and all veterans who had fallen through the cracks. Caroline Reese went on to found a nonprofit legal organization dedicated to defending homeless veterans, funded in part by the restitution payments from Caldwell's estate. And Jake Mitchell? He returned to his team, to the shadows and the silent wars. But before he left, he made sure Sarah had his direct contact number, a veteran support network, and a promise. If you ever need me, I'm one phone call away. Always. As his truck pulled away from the apartment, Sarah stood on the porch with Ranger at her side, waving. She wasn't homeless anymore. She wasn't broken anymore. She was a survivor. And she had a brother who would move heaven and earth to protect her. In the back seat of Jake's truck, Axe rested his head on his paws, his eyes half closed, his mission complete. The quiet warrior and his loyal K9 had walked into a town in crisis, stood up for the defenseless, and changed everything. And as the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the message was clear. Heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear dog tags, and sometimes they walk on 4 legs. 6 months had passed since the arrests, and Cascade Falls had undergone a transformation that no one could have predicted. The morning sun broke over the mountains, casting long shadows across what locals now called Mitchell Memorial Park. The 200 acres of pristine wilderness that Marcus Caldwell had planned to pave over for luxury condos now served a far nobler purpose. A network of hiking trails wound through old-growth forest, leading to a beautiful lakeside clearing where a modest but dignified veterans retreat center stood. The building was simple timber and stone, designed to blend with the landscape rather than dominate it. Inside were 20 private rooms, a communal dining hall, a therapy center staffed by VA-certified counselors, and a specialized wing for veterans transitioning out of homelessness. It had been funded entirely by the restitution money from Caldwell's seized assets, along with donations that poured in from across the country after Sarah's story went viral. Above the main entrance, a bronze plaque read, "Mitchell House, a place of healing for those who served." Sarah stood in front of that plaque every morning, still unable to believe it was real. She had been hired as the facility's outreach coordinator, a position that allowed her to use her own experience to help other veterans navigate the labyrinth of VA services and social support systems. She worked 3 days a week, enough to keep her busy, but not so much that it triggered her PTSD. The rest of her time was spent in therapy, volunteering at the local animal shelter with Ranger, and slowly, carefully, rebuilding a life she thought she'd lost forever. This particular morning, she was leading a group session in the main hall. 12 veterans sat in a circle, ranging in age from their 20s to their 70s. Some were recently homeless, referred by local shelters. Others were struggling with employment, addiction, or the invisible wounds of war. All of them had come here seeking the same thing: hope. "I'm not going to lie to you," Sarah said, her voice steady and clear. "The path back isn't easy. There are going to be days when you want to give up, when the bureaucracy feels impossible, when the memories are too heavy. I know, because I've been there." She gestured to Ranger, who lay beside her chair, his graying muzzle resting on his paws. "This guy right here saved my life more times than I can count. Not because he was trained to, but because he loved me when I couldn't love myself. And my brother," she paused, emotion flickering across her face. "He reminded me that I wasn't alone, that I was worth fighting for." One of the veterans, a young woman named Corporal Amy Chen, who had served in Iraq, raised her hand tentatively. "How did you stop feeling like a burden? Like you were just taking up space?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "I didn't stop feeling that way all at once. It was gradual. Every small win, getting into the apartment, getting my first paycheck, waking up without a nightmare, Each one was proof that I deserved to be here. And surrounding myself with people who saw my worth, even when I couldn't see it myself, that made all the difference. A grizzled former Marine named Tom Harrigan, who had been sleeping in his car for 8 months, spoke up. "Your brother, the SEAL, is it true what they say? That he took down a billionaire just to protect you?" Sarah smiled. "He didn't do it to be a hero. He did it because it was the right thing to do. Jake doesn't see rank or money or power. He sees right and wrong. And when someone crosses that line, especially against someone who can't defend themselves, he acts. That's who he is." She looked around the circle at faces marked by struggle, sacrifice, and survival. "And that's who all of you are, too. You served your country. You put your lives on the line. The fact that the system failed you doesn't diminish that. You're not burdens. You're warriors who deserve better." The room fell into a thoughtful silence. Then Amy Chen spoke again, her voice stronger this time. "So, what do we do? How do we fight back?" "You start by accepting help," Sarah said. "You show up to appointments. You engage with therapy. You let people who care about you in. And then, when you're ready, you help the next person. You turn your pain into purpose." It was a lesson Jake had taught her, and one she was determined to pass forward. Meanwhile, 1,500 miles away, Jake Mitchell was running a very different kind of operation. The target building was a 3-story compound in a hostile urban environment, surrounded by concrete walls and guarded by armed sentries. Intelligence suggested a high-value target was inside, along with critical intelligence materials. The mission parameters were clear: infiltrate, extract, and exfiltrate without engaging unless absolutely necessary. Jake and his 4-man team moved through the darkness like smoke, their movements synchronized from years of training and trust. Axe, fully recovered from his injury and back on active duty, moved beside Jake, with the same lethal grace he'd always possessed. The limp was gone, replaced by the fluid power of a working dog in his prime. They breached the outer wall using a thermal lance to cut through a weak point identified by satellite imagery. Inside, they moved through shadows, using night vision to navigate the maze of corridors. Axe's ears twitched, processing sounds no human could hear, his nose detecting scents that told him exactly how many hostiles were in the building and where they were positioned. At a critical junction, Axe froze, his body going rigid. Jake immediately raised his fist, signaling the team to halt. The German Shepherd's nose pointed toward a doorway that their intelligence had marked as clear. Jake trusted his partner's instincts more than any satellite image. He signaled 2 team members to flank the doorway while he approached with Axe. Using a fiber-optic camera, he checked the room. 3 hostiles, armed, positioned as if waiting for them. It was an informed ambush, one their intelligence had missed. Jake made a series of quick hand signals. The team reconfigured, approaching from an alternate route. They neutralized the ambush without firing a shot, using suppressed weapons and tactical efficiency. The high-value target was secured, along with 2 hard drives containing actionable intelligence. 37 minutes after infiltration, they were exfiltrating to the extraction point. As the helicopter lifted off, Jake scratched Axe behind the ears. "Good boy. You saved us back there." Axe's tail wagged once, his dark eyes gleaming with satisfaction. To him, it was just another day's work. But Jake knew better. That instinctive alert, that refusal to proceed despite their orders, had prevented a firefight that could have cost lives. Axe wasn't just a tool or a weapon. He was a teammate, a brother in arms, who had earned his place on the team 1,000 times over. When Jake finally had downtime 3 weeks later, his first call was to Sarah. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright. "Jake, are you safe?" "Always," he lied smoothly. "How are things at the center?" "Busy. We're at full capacity, and there's a waiting list. Caroline's nonprofit is funding a second location in Billings." She listened as he filled her in on the sanitized version of his recent mission, leaving out anything classified. When he finished, she asked the question she always asked. "When are you coming home?" Home. The word used to mean his team, his base, the next mission. But somewhere in the past 6 months, it had started to mean something different. "I've got leave coming up in 2 months," Jake said. "I'll be there for a week. Maybe longer if I can swing it." Sarah's voice softened. "Ranger misses you. So do I." "I miss you too, Sarah." They talked for another 20 minutes, Sarah filling him in on the small victories of the veterans she was working with, the progress of the park, and the way the town had rallied around the center. Cascade Falls had gone from a place of corruption and fear to a community that took pride in serving those who had served them. Before they hung up, Sarah said something that made Jake's throat tighten. "You know what you did here, Jake? You didn't just save me. You saved this whole town. You reminded people what it means to stand up for what's right." "I just did what needed to be done," Jake replied. "Exactly," Sarah said. "That's what makes you a hero." After the call ended, Jake sat in the quiet of his barracks room, axe sprawled on a dog bed beside him. He thought about the word hero and how uncomfortable it made him. He didn't do this work for recognition or praise. He did it because someone had to stand between the innocent and the wolves. But maybe Sarah was right. Maybe heroism wasn't about seeking glory. Maybe it was about showing up when no one else would, about using your strength to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. He thought about Marcus Caldwell, rotting in a federal prison, and felt no satisfaction. Revenge had never been the goal. Justice was, and justice had been served. His phone buzzed with a message from his team commander. "New mission brief tomorrow, 0600. High priority. Wheels up in 72 hours. Jake replied with a simple, "Roger that." The world was full of Marcus Caldwells, men and women who used power to hurt rather than help. And as long as that was true, there would be work for men like Jake Mitchell. He looked down at Axe, who gazed back at him with those impossibly intelligent eyes. "Ready for the next one, boy?" Axe's tail thumped against the floor. Back in Cascade Falls, winter was giving way to an early spring. The snow had melted from the lower elevations, revealing patches of green and the first brave wildflowers pushing through the damp earth. Caroline Reese stood at a podium in the main hall of Mitchell House, addressing a crowd of local officials, veterans advocates, and media representatives who had gathered for the 6-month anniversary celebration of the center's opening. "When I first met Sarah Mitchell," Caroline said, her voice clear and strong, "she was a woman who had been failed by every system designed to protect her. She was homeless, traumatized, and invisible. Her story should have ended in tragedy. But it didn't, because one person refused to walk away." She gestured to Sarah, who sat in the front row, uncomfortable with the attention but unable to avoid it. Jake Mitchell didn't just save his sister. He exposed a criminal enterprise that was poisoning this community. He reminded us that justice isn't just for the wealthy and powerful. It's for everyone, especially those who have sacrificed the most. The crowd erupted in applause. Sarah felt her cheeks flush, but she also felt something else. Pride. Not in the attention, but in what had been accomplished. Caroline continued. "In the past 6 months, Mitchell House has served 87 veterans. 62 have successfully transitioned into permanent housing. 45 have secured employment. 31 have reconnected with estranged family members. And most importantly, not a single veteran who came through these doors has returned to the streets." More applause, louder this time. "But we can't rest on these victories," Caroline said, her tone shifting to one of determination. "There are thousands more veterans out there who need help. That's why I'm announcing today the expansion of the Mitchell House model to 3 additional locations across Montana, with plans for 10 more sites nationwide within the next 2 years. The announcement was met with a standing ovation. After the ceremony, Sarah found herself surrounded by well-wishers and reporters. One journalist, a young woman from a national veterans magazine, pulled her aside. "Miss Mitchell, what would you say to other homeless veterans who have lost hope?" Sarah thought carefully before answering. "I'd tell them that they're not alone, even when it feels like they are. I'd tell them that asking for help isn't weakness, it's courage. And I'd tell them that somewhere out there are people who care, who will fight for them. They just have to hold on long enough to find them." The journalist scribbled notes. "And what about your brother? Do you think he understands the impact he's had?" Sarah smiled. Jake doesn't do this for recognition. He does it because it's who he is. But yes, I think he knows, and I think it matters to him more than he'd ever admit. As evening fell and the crowds dispersed, Sarah walked the trails of Mitchell Park with Ranger at her side. The dog moved more slowly now, his age catching up to him, but his spirit was undimmed. They reached the lakeside clearing, where a simple bench had been installed, a plaque on it reading, "For those who need a moment of peace." Sarah sat, and Ranger settled at her feet with a contented sigh. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the fall into darkness, the brutal moment when Marcus Caldwell had kicked Ranger, the arrival of her brother like an avenging angel. She thought about the nights in the motel room, the terror of facing her demons in therapy, the slow, painful climb back to functionality. And she thought about all the veterans who were still out there, sleeping under bridges and in cars, trapped in their own private wars. The work wasn't finished. It would never be finished. But for the first time in years, Sarah felt like she had a purpose beyond mere survival. She pulled out her phone and typed a message to Jake. "Thank you for seeing me when I was invisible. Thank you for fighting when I couldn't. I love you, big brother." The reply came 3 hours later, when Jake was in a different time zone preparing for a different battle. "Love you too, Sarah. Always. Stay strong." 3 simple words that carried the weight of an unbreakable bond. In the darkness of a ready room on a military base whose location was classified, Jake Mitchell checked his gear one final time. Axe sat beside him, alert and ready, his tactical vest secured, his eyes scanning the room with professional vigilance. The mission brief had been clear. Hostile territory, high risk, critical intelligence. It was the kind of operation that could go wrong in 1,000 different ways. But Jake wasn't thinking about the risks. He was thinking about Sarah, about the center that bore his family name, about the veterans who were being given second chances. He was thinking about why he did this work, not for glory, not for recognition, but because someone had to stand in the gap between the innocent and those who would do them harm. He looked down at Axe, who looked back at him with absolute trust. "Let's go to work," Jake said quietly. And together, the warrior and his loyal partner walked into the night, ready to face whatever came next. Because that's what heroes do. They show up, they stand firm, and they never, ever abandon their people. The fight wasn't over. It never would be. But as long as there were people like Jake Mitchell and Sarah Mitchell in the world, people who refused to let injustice win, who turned their pain into purpose, who stood up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves, there was hope. And sometimes, hope is all you need to change the world. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to be reminded that heroes still exist. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and let us know in the comments. What was your favorite moment? Was it Axe's loyalty, Jake's protection, or the moment justice was served? We read every comment. God bless, and see you in the next story.